Welcome to Human Risk, a podcast dedicated to the understanding of human behaviour as a risk. Here's your host, Christian Hunt.
Hello and welcome back to the Human Risk podcast. On this episode, I'm exploring a shocking story that illustrates human risk at its absolute worst. It's a tale that's rightly been described as one of the biggest miscarriages of justice in British history. If you're in the UK, you've probably heard of the Great Post Office scandal. What you're about to hear is the tale of how a £1 billion IT system, introduced by the Post Office, hence the name, became an enormous legal, ethical and political scandal. Hundreds of sub-postmasters and postmistresses, those are the formal titles for the people who run local post offices in the UK, were alleged to have engaged in theft, false accounting and/or fraud and were taken to court by the Post Office. This resulted in criminal convictions, imprisonment, loss of reputation and livelihood, bankruptcy, divorce, and even suicide amongst those involved. It subsequently transpired that it wasn't people that were at fault, but rather the £1 billion IT system that the Post Office had installed as part of a modernisation programme. And obviously, IT systems don't take people to court, install themselves or program themselves, at least not yet. My guest, Nick Wallis, is a journalist and radio presenter who heard about the story and decided to investigate. And he's just written a book about it called The Great Post Office Scandal, which is an absolutely astonishing read. In our discussion, we explore how the scandal occurred, Nick's experience in investigating it, and what lessons we can learn. This is a tale of appalling human decision-making with serious consequences. It's about as human risk relevant as it gets. The more I hear about the story, the more shocking it becomes. So I know you're going to find what Nick has to say incredibly interesting. So here's my discussion with Nick Wallis about the Great Post Office Scandal. Nick, welcome to the Human Risk podcast.
Thanks for having me.
It's an absolute pleasure. Can you tell my listeners a little bit about yourself?
Yes, I am a broadcast journalist by trade. I was trained up by the BBC more than 20 years ago. I left the BBC staff in 2004 and went freelance. Started picking up work at 5 Live, ITN, Channel 5 News. And although television pays better and is more fun because you get to go to more places, I always loved radio. And so in 2009, when I was offered the breakfast show at BBC Surrey, I accepted it with both hands. And that was where I picked up the Post Office Horizon story. Since then, I have gone back to being freelance, making various programs for Channel 5, working back at Channel 5 News, and learning my trade as an investigative journalist. And as a result of that, the Post Office story has been a very interesting one to follow because it's allowed me to make a couple of panoramas, a Private Eye special with Richard Brooks last year, a Radio 4 series. I'm currently working on another panorama, and earlier this year I released a book about it. Or published a book about it. Sorry, I'm too used to the broadcast terminology. I published a book called The Great Post Office Scandal.
Fantastic. And we will come on and talk about that because that's obviously the key reason I wanted you on the show. But can you tell us a little bit about the story of how you came across this Post Office scandal?
Yeah, I was sitting in the BBC Radio Surrey breakfast studio, monitoring the Twitter feed. I was very proud of setting up the BBC Surrey Twitter feed when I arrived. I was at this time something of a social media evangelist. And so I said, look, we've got to have a Twitter feed. It's a great new way of communicating with the radio station and connecting us with listeners. And I was idly monitoring it during the show, and a tweet popped up from a cab firm asking if they could bid for the BBC Surrey taxi account, which tickled me because BBC Surrey is such a tiny station. The idea that we'd have a taxi account was amusing. So if we did have one, I would have forwarded the tweet to management and thought no more about it. But because we didn't, I said, well, that depends on whether you want to come on air and tell us some of your fabulous stories. I've still got the tweet. That's not the exact wording, but I'm paraphrasing. And the response was, oh, I've got a story, all right. Call me after the show. So I got this account number and gave the person behind it a call. His name was Devinder Misra. he told me that his wife had earlier that week been thrown in prison for a crime she didn't commit. And it was all down to a dodgy IT system running out of the post office counter that they ran in West Byfleet. And I sat and listened to him talk for 40 minutes. He was very emotional, as you might expect him to be, but he was absolutely adamant and insistent that this was the case. And furthermore, he told me he wasn't alone. There was an organisation called the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, and there was already some material in the public domain about this, an article by Computer Weekly, which had been published in 2009. And yet I'd not heard of this, and none of my colleagues had heard of it. I Googled around, and it was pretty much that Computer Weekly article and nothing else. As far as I could tell, the BBC hadn't done anything on this. So I took it to my boss and said, look, I'm going to go and see this guy. Went to his flat in West Byfleet, recorded an interview with him. His story didn't change at all. He seemed very genuine. He was still obviously terribly upset. And after that interview, I put together the various information that was already out there in the public domain. I spoke to Alan Bates, who was the founder of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance. He gave me pretty much chapter and verse on what was wrong with this IT system and what had happened to him and various other people like him. And I took it to my boss and said, look, I think we should do something. And she put me on to BBC Inside Out South, which was run by a brilliant journalist called Jane French. And she commissioned the story within a day and said, if it checks out, we'll make it the lead item in our new series and you can present it. So I then spent the next 2 or 3 months working with two of Inside Out's brilliant investigative journalists, learning a lot about the craft and learning a lot about the story at the same time. And it culminated in the first investigation that I did on this, both on BBC Surrey Radio and on Inside Out South on the 7th of February 2011. So that's more than 10 years ago now.
Wow. And so this is, I find this remarkable because you're doing a sort of local radio with a bit, I'm assuming it's chat and a bit of music and sort of local issues and traffic and weather and those sorts of local community pieces. And this just pops in your lap and you decide, because you're curious, I guess, to pursue this. I mean, this isn't something that you would naturally do in that role. I mean, you could easily do that presenting role without sort of diving into this. This is your curiosity at play here. Yeah,
I mean, all journalists are desperate for stories. I mean, although on the other side of the coin now, I'm fending off stories, which is a very privileged position to be in because of what I've got a profile doing. I do get people coming to me with amazing stories, which I simply don't have the bandwidth to deal with, which is depressing. But when you're, a not very well established journalist in a small corner of the country, doing your best to keep interest in your own profession ticking over as much as sort of what you're doing on a day-to-day basis, you're always looking out for a story. You should always be looking out for a story. And, when someone tells you, I've got something to tell you, then the skill is quickly triaging it to see if it makes sense and if there is something there or potentially something there or worth trying to bring to the attention of a commissioning editor to see if they'll resource it, because that's one of the biggest problems with journalism. There are plenty of stories that could well be investigated, but just don't because the money isn't around. And it just so, it was a big story. I mean, if his pregnant wife had been sent to prison for a crime she didn't commit, that was a big story. And so therefore, why not follow it up? Why wouldn't you?
Right. And so can you, for people that haven't come across a particular overseas list, can you just give us a sort of summary as, what is the story?
In 1999-2000, the post office was just about to roll out a computer system to every single one of its 20,000 post offices around the UK. It was the big automation project, because up until that point, the post office had essentially operated on a pen and paper principle with isolated tills and handwritten accounts, which were entered on a huge ledger, which was then folded up and sent to the post office's headquarters in Chesterfield. Each postmaster in a branch is an agent of the post office. They run their own businesses and they present their accounts to the post office at the end of every week. This automation system was going to be the big bang. Suddenly, the post office would have back-end servers and a direct line of communication to every single post office in the country. It was a mixture of electronic point of sale, i.e. a till, and an accounting system. It worked on a touchscreen basis, so postmasters would be pressing the buttons on their screens to tot up the various different products the post office was selling to customers or dispensing in terms of benefits, etc. And then every night, the post office would receive a bundled up electronic missive from each post office around the country as they reconciled the accounts whilst the post offices were closed. So that was the plan. At the time it was rolled out, it was described by Fujitsu, the people who constructed and operated it under a PFI deal for the post office, as the largest non-military IT system in Europe. And the fundamental problem was it didn't work. It was, and I spoke to a development manager who was brought in to try and fix it. It was a prototype which had been lashed together and was dragged kicking and screaming into the real world. And that should never have been done. And one of the biggest problems was with the cash account, the cash writing account, what should be an incredibly secure data writing system within the software, which took all the sums that had been added up over the course of the day, compiled them, and then forwarded them to the post office back end. I mean, that wasn't the only problem, but that piece of software didn't work. Great holes in accounts started appearing for these postmasters. And because of the unequal way in which the postmaster's contract is set up, a postmaster is held liable for all losses that they can't prove weren't their fault. So the post office would take assurances from Fujitsu that there was nothing wrong with the computer system and say to the postmaster, well, you've got a £2,000, £3,000, £4,000, £10,000 gap in your accounts. Nothing wrong with our computer system. The onus is on you to make that good out of your own money, out of your own retail takings or your own savings or your own parents' and relatives' savings as it went to be. Because the post office could withdraw the office of sub-postmaster from a postmaster without reason with 3 months warning. And a postmaster would often invest tens of thousands of pounds in taking over a business which had a post office within it. You couldn't just buy a post office. You had to agree retail terms with the outgoing incumbent, and then you had to apply for the post office to be appointed a sub-postmaster. So it was within the post office's gift to give and remove with 3 months' notice. And so they use this as a huge stick to beat the sub-postmasters with. If you do not make good this hole in your accounts, then we will remove this post office from you. If you do not open for business because you no longer trust this IT system, then you are in breach of contract and we will remove this post office from you. So this was an incredibly unfair situation which found thousands of sub-postmasters around the country over 20 years funneling their own money into this IT system to make good what were largely imaginary holes in the accounts. There may have been reconciliation errors and there may have been all sorts of other problems. But this money was just being chucked into the post office to fill these supposed gaps without any investigation by the post office as to what might be causing these gaps in the first place, which meant that the system never improved and the situation carried on going. If the post office decided that the gap had got too large, it would shut you down, sack you from the business, and then go after you through the criminal courts. The post office, for historical reasons, has its own prosecution and investigation function. Its investigation function is older than the police service in the United Kingdom. And the post office, just by way of example, is older than Great Britain. It was formed 40 years before the Act of Union between England and Scotland. It has its own investigation function and it has its own prosecution arm. And therefore, without any checks and balances by the police or the Crown Prosecution Service, the post office, having decided that it was the victim of a criminal offence by a sub-postmaster, would then go after those sub-postmasters through the criminal courts and arraign them on charges of false accounting, theft, fraud, misrepresentation in public office, etc., until it had a criminal conviction, which could allow it to go after them for a Proceeds of Crime Act in order to fill these holes, these at times imaginary holes in these accounts. And they did this at a rate of one a week. They secured a successful conviction on average once a week every year for 13 years. 736 people were criminally convicted by the post office prosecutors between the year 2000 and 2013. And it was only when they finally banded together with litigation funding to take their case to the High Court that the postmasters finally cracked this open and proved the post office had essentially failed to disclose really important information about the Horizon IT system, and had essentially gone about this awful miscarriage of justice, prosecuting innocent people for crimes they didn't commit.
There's so many details in that are just unbelievable, where you would kind of go, why didn't somebody stop to think, right? You'd expect maybe a few cases of fraud somewhere, but this sounds like it was, they had a team out there that was regular. So somebody could have stopped and gone, hold on a minute, this seems to be happening quite a lot. We seem to be pursuing quite a lot of postmasters and postmistresses. And yet nobody stopped.
No, you don't become a postmaster unless you have a spotless record. You're not allowed to handle money and take on public office unless you have lived a very good and sensible life. Many people took on post offices as their last job before retirement, something to do with their partners, one managing the retail side, one managing the post office counter, as a nice little nest egg that they could sell on and retire on the proceeds. Many had come from positions in business. Some had come from retail positions but wanted the extra footfall and prestige that a post office brought them. And they were all the ones that I've met are just, the very best examples of us. They're hardworking, diligent, entrepreneurial, bright, friendly, community-minded, approachable, all those things. So the idea that they would suddenly turn to criminality because they were running a post office beggars belief. Even if all 736 of them had turned to criminality, you would have thought someone would say there must be something wrong with our business processes that is turning this many people criminal. The problem is one of snobbery and class distinction, which arose in the Victorian era. In the Victorian era, you had postmasters and sub-postmasters. Postmasters were employed by the post office. They ran the entire mail operation in any given region. And what that meant was that they were given a uniform, they were given a grand office, they were given a huge amount of power over the Royal Mail operation and the post office counters in their area, and they had prestige. They weren't quite gentlemen because, of course, they worked for a living, but they were public figures, respected, paid for by the state, wearing a uniform which denoted their importance to all and sundry. Sub-postmasters, on the other hand, were seen as a necessary evil. They were lower middle class, socially ambitious shopkeepers who desired to be associated with this august institution, the post office. And if they successfully applied for a position of sub-postmaster, they had to pay for their own uniforms and fixtures and fittings themselves. And they were there on tolerance of the post office because the post office needed them. In the massive expansion of the railways in the 19th century, you had a huge expansion of the mail business. And so the post office simply couldn't keep up with the number of post offices it needed. So it essentially allowed these franchises to develop. But it never quite trusted these people. It always thought that there was something inferior about them, that they weren't quite one of us. So this class divide between the post office and its sub-postmasters is deeply, deeply rooted. And it's what allowed the post office to develop this idea that its sub-postmasters were grubby little shopkeepers, failed publicans and police officers, as one is quoted as saying in my book, who are tempted by this access to public money and so easily could be on the take. And were it not for these guardians of the Queen's shilling, the good people up at the post office, keeping a very sharp and punitive eye on these people, then money would go missing left, right and centre. And so when the huge number of prosecutions increased at the turn of this century, because of the Horizon system, the post office didn't stop to think that there might be something wrong with the Horizon system. They thought, aha, now that we've got automated, now that we've got a window into what's going on in these post offices, we're rooting out the criminality wherever it happens.
And that's astonishing. And presumably this is something you didn't know before. These sort of features is something you discovered in your investigations.
Yeah, and that was the joy of writing the book, because broadcast journalism, as I'm sure you're aware, is necessarily impressionistic. You don't get the opportunity. I mean, you do the work, you do the research, but you're focused on getting out a half-hour panorama, which means you don't get to do those huge historical, explanatory deep dives into the underlying problems with any scandal or situation. And doing the book did allow me to do quite a bit of research in that area, and it allowed me to understand, for instance, what the post office is. It's the oldest secular agency of state. Henry VIII set up a master of the post. Charles II set up a general post office. That the GPO is a brand that is the oldest secular brand in the United Kingdom and only was abolished in 1969. There's a post in sight of where I'm doing this podcast from at the end of my garden, which has the initials GPO stenciled into it. It is a huge and very important part of the British national psyche, and it has august and ancient proximity to power, which it abused really, really badly through a mixture of bureaucratic indifference, malice, and incompetence. And the Horizon system just basically allowed the people within the post office to exercise that power indiscriminately without checks or balances from above or below.
And if we look at the system, the Fujitsu system, presumably this was done on the basis of, well, we better get this thing automated, so we'll do it as cheaply as possible. And presumably they didn't have any expertise in employing this sort of system, because I'm guessing it's the first time the post office has really tried to modernize itself in that sense. So you've got a sort of recipe for disaster, presumably around, let's keep this and make it as cheap as possible. And we haven't really done procurement projects of this kind before.
Well, if you'll excuse my language, it was a colossal shit show from start to finish. The PFI deal that was set up was a £1 billion arrangement between the benefits agency and the post office as two distinct clients. The idea was that the benefits agency would start dispensing its benefits on a swipe card, and that the post office would provide the place to swipe the card and dispense the benefits. As the project continued, and Fujitsu, who were chosen because they were cheapest, realized that they couldn't actually get the system to work, the benefits agency developed cold feet, decided that it didn't want to do swipe cards, and that actually it was going to try and push benefits recipients towards receiving their benefits direct into their bank accounts, which would destroy the post office's footfall by, I think, a third overnight, and also completely obliterate the business model on which the Horizon system was originally envisaged, which would be Fujitsu would set up this system at its own cost and then get a guaranteed sum per swipe of benefits card for the next 8 years. So the contract was completely renegotiated. The benefits agency walked away from the project. The post office was left holding the baby. And in 2000, the year that the system was rolled out, the National Audit Office in this country did a root and branch investigation into the whole debacle and concluded that £500 million of public money had been wasted before the system was even rolled out. And then when it was rolled out, it was a complete disaster. But you're right, there wasn't enough expertise, according to some of the people I spoke to who were around at the time, there wasn't enough expertise within the post office to really understand and evaluate exactly what this system was doing and how well it worked. And where there was that expertise, and there was some there at middle management in some of the IT departments, Fujitsu, who was so fed up with being mucked around by the government, by the post office and the benefits agency, who kept changing the spec of this system almost on a weekly basis, if you believe the evidence that was given to the parliamentary select committees at the time, they basically put a curtain around the project and said, look, it's a PFI deal. The terms of this project do not allow you to properly test and investigate what we are cooking up, behind this curtain. So therefore, we're going to get on with it. We're going to operate it, and we're going to tell you how well or badly it's working. And what that created was an environment where Fujitsu had an incentive under its service level agreement not to tell the post office of any bugs and glitches that were causing service interruptions. They just had this incentive to fix them as soon as possible before any fines kicked in. And ideally, not tell the post office unless it was blindingly obvious that something had fallen over. The post office had an incentive to believe Fujitsu when it told it that everything was hunky-dory and that there must be a problem with the sub-postmasters and go after them because it was cheaper to do so. Far harder to sue Fujitsu or insist that they get in a bunch of independent IT experts to properly do a root and branch review of this system. Far easier to go and menace a sub-postmaster under threat of losing their business to hand over 20 grand in order to fill this imaginary hole in the accounts, which had been generated by the computer system.
I mean, it is on so many levels just On the one hand, I mean, I'm struggling a little bit here because on the one hand, it's entirely believable. Like, so having spent a bit of time dealing in sort of government processes, you can see how if inefficiencies and sort of processes that look good on paper land in reality, and then you add that legacy historical element of structure that you so eloquently explained. So on the one hand, I sort of say, well, that's I could sort of see how that could happen. On the other hand, this is 21st century Britain, not some sort of tin pot country where perhaps there isn't sort of due process of law. And so I'm really struggling to balance those two things out, saying I'm not surprised and yet I'm shocked.
There are three things here which feed into that problem, which make it not unique, but almost a perfect storm. The first is that if you have a shonky IT system and you are a bank and discrepancies start appearing in your bank teller's cash trays, and this is happening on a regular basis, then what you do is you do a quick assessment of the bank teller and you assume, or you have no evidence that they're taking any money. You do a proper investigation into your IT system, you find the problem and you improve it. And any losses along the way are shouldered by the shareholders of the bank. In this situation, all the risk, was shouldered by the sub-postmaster. And the post office didn't do any investigation. So not only did you have the postmaster having to carry the can for any discrepancies under this sort of threat of prosecution, but you also had no incentive or ability to improve the processes of the machine that was going wrong. So a mistake that manifested itself in one end of the business in Orkney could equally be happening down in Skegness or in Cornwall. And the post office wasn't even collecting any kind of central record of where things were going seriously wrong so that they could look at themes and analyze how or where it might be happening. They'd basically completely outsourced all responsibility, as well as the operation of this Horizon system, to Fujitsu, who had its own reasons for keeping things on the quiet. The second thing was that the post office had bet the farm on Horizon. It could not believe that it could fail. Because of the decline in footfall for benefits customers, who would provide a huge and important part of its business, as the government tried to shift more people towards getting their benefits put directly into their bank accounts, the post office realized that in order to keep its network alive, it would have to start doing business deals with other organizations. Bank of Ireland was operated a number of its accounts. It also did deals with the electricity companies, all of which involved interfacing the Horizon system with the technology run by the various clients, who would start putting business through the post office and start giving them payments for every transaction that the post office carried out on their behalf. So they had this incentive to tell their clients that Horizon was the Rolls-Royce bulletproof, absolutely faultless machine. Because if any clients got frit and didn't send any business their way, then they would start to see a withering network. The final element to that is this lack of scrutiny from beneath. Whilst no one was watching what the post office was doing from above, because the government had decided it was a private company, and although it was the sole shareholder, it was it had to operate on an arm's length basis. So no one questioned what the post office was up to at anything other than a very high strategic level. And all the government was interested in was the post office washing its face, so it didn't need any further subsidy. No one was scrutinizing it from below. The National Federation of Sub-Postmasters, which is the sort of putative union for sub-postmasters, had also bet the farm on Horizon. If there was any loss of confidence in the Horizon system and the number of clients, electricity companies, banks, etc., BBC, for instance, through the license fee, lost confidence in the system's ability to function, then the viability of individual post offices, i.e. the individual agents' businesses, would start to deteriorate. And the nest eggs that Mr. and Mrs. Miggins had bought in order to sell on before they retired would start to decline in value. So the National Federation of Sub-Postmasters took a policy decision at the highest level not to make any public criticism of the Horizon system, and to throw individual members who were being prosecuted and screaming out in their very moments of desperation that there was something wrong with this computer system. They threw them under a bus. And I've said in the book that I feel the NFSP is perhaps more culpable than any organisation in this scandal, because their sole job was to protect their membership. And when their members came to them in their direst hour of need, they just cut them loose and watch them drown, which I find absolutely unforgivable. I mean, you can say, yeah, the post office, obviously they were the ones doing the prosecuting. Obviously they knew what they were up to. And by the time they became fully aware there were serious problems with the Horizon system, they doubled down and covered up. And that is, well, it's potentially a conspiracy to pervert the course of justice, if you look at it from one angle. But they were still protecting their own business. Whereas the NFSP, its job was to protect its members. And it failed on that because it decided that the good of the whole was better than a few innocent people being thrown in prison.
And I mean, it's fascinating because you sort of, again, you would assume approaching this story that somebody must be keeping an eye on this stuff, right? So start point is, I have a background in financial services regulation, right? So I know if you're a bank, yeah, they might not do a great job all of the time, but there is at least a regulator that's looking at that stuff. And so I, as an ordinary citizen, I make the presumption that someone's keeping an eye on the post office, because that seems to be kind of important from, I don't know, payment systems and all of these important things that flow through it as a sort of a utility, if you like, as a provider. It seems to be quite important. And yet, it's astonishing when you say that there's no one keeping an eye on it.
No, I mean, the government is the sole shareholder. The Secretary of State for Business owns the post office on behalf of the taxpayer. The government instructed Alice Perkins, who was the incoming chair in 2012, and Paula Venables, who was the incoming chief executive in the same year, that their job was to make the post office wash its face by 2020. They gave them more than £1 billion to do that. And beyond that, they pretty much said, off you go. When postmasters started jumping up and down and attracting the attention of their MPs in Parliament, who also came together and went, well, hang on a minute, I've got two constituents saying this and you've got two constituents saying, how many people, what are we looking at? When MPs started realizing that there had to be some kind of serious problem because they were having face-to-face meetings with these individuals and quickly clocking that they were unlikely to be criminals, the post office was not interested. It saw this problem as an inconvenience which stopped it on its journey towards profitability, which was the government mandated task of the senior leadership. You can ask lots of very important questions about where were the internal auditors, what were the external auditors saying, and I've managed to get hold of one report in which the external auditors do say that the IT within the post office is not fit for purpose. And there was a BAE Systems report by one of its subsidiaries called Detica, which spelled out just how awful the post office's software was. And yet the post office restricted them from having any communication with the Second Sight investigation team, who were tasked with looking into whether there were problems with the IT system. They realized they had a problem. They did everything they could to cover it up and make it go away, with the result that hundreds of people were denied justice for a period of years, which is against their fundamental human right.
I'm intrigued as you're unpicking this as a journalist. You must be just like every turn. It sounds like there's just something else. This is such a hence you can write a highly readable, fascinating account. But what are you thinking as you're going through all these pieces? Because it's sort of it's like your eyes must be popping out more and more and more as you go through this. It's almost overwhelming. The scale of what's happening here and all of these different dynamics. Absolutely astonishing.
I am quite a cynical person, and I think I have a natural inbuilt suspicion of authority, which predated my training as a journalist and probably made me naturally predisposed towards being one. So I always assume that people, when given a choice, will usually choose the path of least resistance. And if there is a financial incentive to do something, it will often be done. Hence why we're always taught to follow the money as journalists. So when you look at the way the post office is set up, how this scandal was allowed to proliferate, essentially, and just, how essentially the post office was able to go rogue over a 20-year period, it's because far too many people in far too many positions took the path of least resistance. And when there was money as an incentive, that was what provided the motivating factor for them to do these things. The post office had a hole in a sub-postmaster's accounts. That hole needed to be justified or filled. By far the easiest, because it's money, it's therefore serious. By far the easiest thing to do is to put the onus on the sub-postmaster to fill that hole, because that's the path of least resistance. When the scale of the scandal becomes apparent to the board of the post office and the civil servants sitting on it, and therefore the government, what's the easiest thing to do? It's not to suddenly go, oh God, we've got a massive miscarriage of justice on our hands. Let's start talking about proper compensation. Someone would say, well, that's going to cost a lot of money and we can't do that. So we're going to have to find a way of making it go away. And they found a way of making it go away for a period of time, because that was the cheapest and easiest thing to do. So people will always go for the cheapest and easiest thing to do. You very, very rarely find a few good souls who will stand up and say, no, this is wrong, because it comes at great cost. Every single whistleblower that I've ever dealt with has gone through, at the very least, extreme anxiety. They have put themselves at risk of losing their homes, and they may have come through okay. There are some I've met who are genuine heroes who put everything on the line, and they've come through relatively unscathed. But on the whole, it's far easier just to keep your head down and get on with things. And that's the way our society is structured. So in answer to your question, when I was reading the final draft of the book before we sent it to the printers, I did at one point going, this is incredible. This really is genuinely But as you spend sort of 10 years looking into it, you just assume that people are going to go for the cheapest and easiest option. And if that means innocent people going to jail, well, as long as their boss isn't telling them that they've got to do something about it, they're not going to do anything about it.
I think your depiction of whistleblowers is fascinating because, as you say, there's something visceral in terms of us as anybody that speaks out. There is a consequence to that because you're calling out the tribe, and we can concoct evolutionary explanations as to why that. But that's a serious issue, and therefore, it strikes me that this is a really good illustration of how journalism can help further. What you've done is a huge endeavour that, without your involvement, probably wouldn't be where it is today. But it's my job, and I think that's the point you're making. There's nothing sort of people have said really nice things about what I've done, but it is simply my job. A big story comes along. And I was a little surprised at first that not enough fellow journalists took it on board as big as it was. But nonetheless, I was allowed to plough my own furrow telling this story. I wonder if I put myself in the shoes of some of the brave people who have come forward at great risk to their professional reputations and future earning prospects who put their hands up, whether I would be able to do the same thing. So it's been a privilege to report on some of the characters involved in this and the determination to get the truth out. They're all mentioned in the book. I mean, Alan Bates, obviously the person who was sacked by the post office in 2003 and vowed to get even, set up the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance, and eventually had his name on the judgment, Bates v. Post Office, that blew the whole thing open in 2019. Ron Warmington from Second Sight, who led the investigation into the post office and was put under severe amounts of pressure to water down his conclusions and basically say that there wasn't anything wrong with the Horizon system. He stuck his ground, and no one likes an independent investigator that comes in and tells the truth, because the company that's paying for them to do that doesn't want to hear the truth. They want to get a whitewash, and he was not prepared to do a whitewash. Richard Roll, who was a Fujitsu technician who very bravely came on our Panorama program and blew the whistle on what was going on behind the curtain at Fujitsu, came under enormous pressure and spent 2 days in a witness box in the High Court, being absolutely battered by the Post Office's QC in a highly stressful environment. But he did it because he thought it was the right thing to do. So there are people who have had far more to lose in bringing this scandal to light than I have. And as I said, I've just had the privilege of being able to document it. And the effort of documenting on your side, I mean, I'm assuming you'll have had lawyers crawling all over what you do at every stage of this, because clearly you're not allowed to go into print or broadcast without reasonable evidence that what you're saying. Was this particularly challenging in this case, or is this sort of par for the course for what you do? No,
when we put the 2015 panorama out, the post office was in its total aggressive batshit denial phase, I would say.
Technical term.
And they did
right.
everything possible. I mean, this was the stage at which it was trying to persuade people that black was white. And we had our hands on documentary evidence, which basically allowed us to go ahead with the panorama. And the post office fought tooth and nail to stop that broadcast going ahead. And then it tied up the production team in endless complaints afterwards. And I was new to Panorama setup at that stage, and was talking to one of the producers sometime afterwards. And I said, blimey, I can't imagine what it's like putting out one of these every week, having to deal with this scale of sort of bureaucratic and administrative stuff around your actual journalism when you're kind of dealing with people who you're making programs about. And he said, I have never dealt with anything on this scale before. That the post office was rogue. It had limitless money. It had proximity to power. It had the tacit approval of the government, who was either looking the other way or allowing it to pursue its desire to cover up the actual truth of what was going on. And it had highly skilled public affairs and PR people doing everything they can to persuade every single journalist and every single editor that when a journalist came to them and said, oh, we think we've got a story about this hooky IT system that's caused, lots of people to go to prison, they would lean on them to say, look, you've got no evidence. You can't publish or broadcast anything without any evidence. And it was, in the end of the day, it was the testimony of the dozens of sub-postmasters, credible individuals with nothing to lose and nothing to gain from making up a story about the IT system, which gave us the public interest argument to say we think there's something wrong here. And it was the sheer scale of it that eventually did for the post office. And had it not been for that and the combined might of the Justice for Sub-Postmasters Alliance strategy at the High Court, which allowed them to pull together funding and some superb litigation lawyers to really dig into the post office's arguments, this story would not have come to light. I mean, I was not a lone voice, because obviously, we'd done a panorama and there were plenty of people who were watching this very closely in the journalistic world. But, the worm turned when those High Court judgments came in 13th of March 2019 and 16th of December 2019. And finally, someone other than the sub-postmasters were endorsing their claims, and also in incredible detail in a bulletproof pair of judgments, which I think will go down in history as some of the finest judgments that have been written about IT and contract law in many, many years. They are still held up as a shining example of someone who did the work, understood the problem, looked at the law and made the correct ruling.
We're into the realms of hypotheticals now, obviously, but is this a standalone thing? And obviously the dynamics of the post office are unique. But is your view that there could be other things like this out there?
This happens all the time. I mean, you look at the infected blood scandal, you look at Hillsborough, you look at the Windrush scandal. This happens all the time. And the reason it happens all the time is because no one is held accountable. If you do not think, let's put it this way. If you believe there are no real consequences to your actions, you don't think your actions through. You follow the path of least resistance. You look at the cheapest option. If you think there's a possibility I might go to jail if I make the wrong decision, or if I do something in bad faith, or if I do something that could be hindering the administration of justice or denying justice to people, innocent people who deserve it, then you might think twice. Then you might step up and go, look, we're all going to go to prison unless we come clean. There's no incentive to do that. The way society is structured, there is no incentive to do that. And so mistakes will be made. And then when the mistakes are uncovered, they will be doubled down on and they become cover-ups. And people then start lying and their positions are maintained because to admit their position is a false position would be a bigger scandal than the original mistake, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It all gets rolled up. And then you just chuck your battalions of lawyers at it, particularly if you're a big company or a government agency or a government department, until the problem goes away. And I cannot see a single way that this is going to change in the future. And there's something I call the Moorhead problem, which was articulated by Professor Richard Moorhead, who's a University of Exeter professor of ethics, legal ethics. And he's taken a very keen interest in this scandal. And he said that you've got a situation whereby the Post Office Board back in 2013, when they realized they were sitting on this scandal, wanted to know what to do. This involved the criminal law, people had been sent to prison. So therefore, they asked the lawyers what they should do. And the way you phrase that problem is extremely important. And I would imagine in 99% of boardroom cases, it is, hello, client law firm, we have a problem. We would like you to help us solve it. And the client law firm goes, right, okay, well, we can make this go away for you in a way that causes minimum impact and damage to your business. Entirely legitimate conversations. But what happens is that when the scandal breaks, the board goes, well, we took legal advice and everything that we did was within the law. And the lawyers go, we provided a legal way through for our clients to carry on trading and doing what they wanted to do. And so you've got a situation whereby you can have the boardroom blaming the lawyers blaming the boardroom. Nothing illegal has happened, and therefore nothing changes. I am profoundly certain that something of this scale could easily happen again. Maybe not with that many miscarriages of justice, maybe not that many people pursued or persecuted through the criminal courts, because you would hope that the justice system has woken up to what has gone on. But in terms of mistake or bad decision causing death, injury, financial loss, which then gets covered up on a grand scale, which then gets lawyered to bits somewhere, and eventually appears 20 years later with the victims sort of trudging slowly towards their graves. That's the way our society is set up, and I don't see that changing.
I mean, implicitly, for that to change, you need a change in the law. You need so to your point, there's a huge. Are you at the point of sort of saying the system's almost been designed for this? Because it seemed to when you were describing the post office, I sort of looked at it and thought, well, not necessarily that this has been the primary purpose, but it's sort of set up in a way that skews incentives and concentrates power. And therefore, when one looks at the way society is set up and some of the privileges and prejudices that are built into this, it's almost baked in. This is going to happen. And so almost the challenge that you're talking about really would require some fundamental shifts that probably aren't going to happen in the short term, if at all, I guess.
No, I mean, there is one thing that could change very quickly, and that is the legal presumption that machines, if they look like they're working correctly, are working correctly. This was brought in the mid-90s after complaints from the courts that people were finding loopholes in speed guns and breathalyzers by saying, aha, well, although I tested over the limit, how can you prove that breathalyzer's working correctly? So up until the late 90s, it was incumbent on the prosecution to prove that their machine was working correctly. There were lots of submissions, including one from the Post Office, to the Law Commission saying that this made the administration of justice very difficult. And so the Law Commission simply removed that provision and then reversed it. Now, that meant that if you find yourself in court and the prosecution is saying, well, look, this accounting system has always worked very, very well. You can see it working on the desktop of any or the countertop of any post office anywhere in the country. Therefore, the courts must assume it is working well. The courts were obliged to assume it was working well, and it was up to the under-resourced sub-postmasters to prove that this massive IT behemoth wasn't functioning. And if ever there were a legal presumption that wasn't fit for purpose, that was literally designed to stop people trying to pull the wool with breathalyzers and speed guns, it's applying it to these sprawling, complex IT ecosystems, which nowadays have so much going on inside them that mistakes are almost always inevitable. I mean, the only way to have a perfect IT system is to have perfect code written by perfect human beings operating in a perfect environment with perfect hardware.
And perfect data, right? Which may also not be right.
Yeah. Well, and as Darren Jones MP, who's the chair of the Base Select Committee, said in a debate earlier this year, you're now looking at AI machines, which will come up with outputs which their developers had no idea they could possibly achieve. So how on earth can you say with any certainty that something's working correctly or incorrectly. So that's one legal side of things that needs to change immediately, specifically with regard to IT. But in terms of the wider social point that you're making, not a single person has been censured or held to account for what has happened in this scandal. The Health and Safety Executive has the right to criminally prosecute people who have been lax with health and safety. When that law came in, and forgive me, I can't remember exactly when it was, I think it was the late 80s, early 90s. When that law came in, when directors of a company could be criminally prosecuted for failures in health and safety, there was a plethora, there was an explosion in the health and safety business, if that's not too an inapt word. All sorts of courses and procedures were brought in to make employees safer at work, because directors knew that they could go to prison if they had been negligent or made their working environments unreasonably unsafe. Could something be brought in similarly to the decisions that are made in a corporate world which don't relate to physical harm? That is something that bigger brains than mine will need to chew over. But until boards of directors are made potentially criminally liable for, let's say, covering up an injustice, let's say covering up a scandal or a mistake, which I think, it's pretty easy to perhaps legislate for, because everyone makes mistakes, everyone makes bad decisions. You get some bad apples making bad decisions in bad faith. But if that is then covered up, then that could be prosecutable, I guess. I don't know. I mean, but until people think, what is the path of least resistance here? Is it that we cover this up and we risk criminal prosecution? Or is it that we come out into the open and say, look, we have a responsibility as directors to point out that our company has made terrible mistakes. We're legally required to do so at threat of going to prison if we don't. But the moment you remove any potential threat to those individuals, if they think that actually it's in the best interest of the company if we kept this quiet, and actually our shareholders and the government might prefer it that way, and it's not going to have any comeback on us because we'll be long gone with our big pension pots by then they're going to make the easiest decision every single time.
Wrapping us up, the book, phenomenal labour of love, and I wouldn't have had you on the show if I didn't think it was an absolutely cracking read. So we'll put links to that and your newsletter and other things in the show notes. You published it, and so what was the reaction when it came out?
I've been delighted. Well, all right, I'll be perfectly honest with you. The thing I am happiest about, having spent days looking at the text before it went to print, was that no one has yet found a single typo. believe me, there were several very highly stressed people looking at that book, because it's 170,000 words long, and you have to eliminate and exterminate typos wherever you see them. And we actually did send the book to print with a typo in that I found afterwards, and I sort of called up in a panic, and they said, "Don't worry, we're still checking the files." And so I've been delighted that no pedant has gone on page 235.
Couldn't help noticing this undermines the integrity of the book.
That doesn't, exactly. Well, it does. I mean, what it's like. You want to get a professional product out there, and so therefore you can't have typos. But every book has at least one, and so I'm delighted by the lack of response.
So pedants aside, that have yet to come out of the woodwork.
The pedants aside, no. Listen, we got a 5-star review in the Law Society Gazette the other day. The FT have given it a glowing review. Joshua Rosenberg, who I'm a big fan of, a legal journalist, reviewed it on the first day it came out and said lovely things. It's got 5 out of 5 stars on Amazon, which can't last forever, but we've had more than 60 reviews and every single one has given it 5 out of 5. So that's thrilling in itself. We're a tiny little publisher, so we couldn't get the book in Waterstones. We couldn't get it in the chain stores actually as stock present, but every independent bookstore that's ordered copies has ordered more. It is flying out of Amazon, and it's flying out of our publishers, who are, as I say, a niche legal publisher, so they've never published a mainstream book like this, and they've had to take on an extra member of staff simply to shift the stock. So I'm really pleased with the way it turned out. I'm obviously the idea was to write a definitive account of the scandal with historical context and background information, but the last thing I wanted it to be was a dull, dry text or reference book. My heroes are Oliver Bullough and Michael Lewis. Oliver Bullough wrote Moneyland, and I don't think Michael Lewis needs any introduction. He wrote Liar's Poker and The Big Short and Flash Boys and the like. And what they do is they turn potentially quite dry subjects into fascinating factual thrillers, and I wanted the book to be a page turner. So it's designed to have a narrative drive. It's designed to keep people gripped. And I'm extremely gratified that there have been so many people who've said that, I've achieved that. So, yeah, I just hope that it continues to sell and continues to raise awareness of the story. And 10% of all the revenue that comes into our publishers is being diverted into a charity that I've set up with the publisher called the Horizon Scandal Fund, which is all about helping a lot of the sub-postmasters who've fallen through the cracks or who've not got it together enough to be able to take on the post office in terms of looking for compensation, etc. It's not that we're providing compensation, we're a tiny little charity, but people who need counselling, people who might want to do art projects, people who want to set up socials between other sub-postmasters because they're so often isolated around the country, or to help them travel to the statutory inquiry hearings next year, or to just sort of get that first bit of funding together that will allow them to have a conversation with a lawyer, which might set them on the path to getting compensation. So yeah, the book's hopefully going to serve a good cause as well as getting the story out there to a public which probably still doesn't quite understand the scale of this scandal.
It's funny because I thought I knew, not that I thought I knew everything, but I thought I'd sort of grasped it. And then I read the book and just, I mean, I said to you before we started recording, WTF doesn't really get there, but it was shocking. And it's the kind of thing, almost, I used to sort of think to myself, if you would pitch this as a movie script, well, we better tone that bit down a bit because that seems a bit ridiculous. And yet, as you beautifully chronicle, it's insane. And I kept going, okay, I've sort of got a handle on this thing. And then you get to another page, you go, what the hell?
We went through a very, very diligent fact-checking process on this book, and it was then the subject of lots of right of reply, legal letters from various protagonists and organizations, and whilst no one likes getting legal threats, they certainly focus the mind. And I am absolutely confident that that book is 100% bulletproof, factually accurate, definitive account of what has been to date a terrible scandal and will continue to rumble on. There's never a good time to write a book in an ongoing scandal, but there was an obvious narrative arc between the first people being prosecuted back in 2000 and then the first convictions being quashed earlier this year. But yeah, there probably will be at some stage a revised and expanded, updated paperback edition, hopefully at the end of the public inquiry. But yeah, you'll mention about it being a film script. There is going to be an ITV drama about this, which I'm thrilled about, which will hopefully be screened in 2023. It's at the writing stage at the moment. And again, one of the joys of that is that it will bring it to a wider audience and people will continue to be scandalized by what happened and the scale of what happened.
Fantastic stuff. And I can't let you go. Tell people about your newsletter, which I always think is when I love reading that as it plops into my inbox.
Well, this was something that sort of was a kind of byproduct of the crowdfunding that I did. I realized that no news editor, no matter how committed they were to the story, was going to pay for me to sit in court for every single day of the group litigation, which started in late 2018. But I knew that if I sat in court, I would learn a huge amount more about the story, be able to put more of it into the public domain and potentially request and secure really important documents, which I could then use to further my journalism. So I basically did a crowdfunding campaign and was extremely gratified again that the appetite for the story amongst people who know about the story is huge enough to fund me essentially at a modest loss to sit through the first month of this trial. But also there was enough money that came in that allowed me to basically kind of cover the next trial. And I sent out newsletters just to keep people informed as to where their money was going and what I was up to and how I was spending their money. And it became the sort of secret email, which I would write free blog posts up on my website so that anyone could get a handle on the story, because that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to do public interest journalism that was free at the point of consumption. But I also wanted to give something extra to the people who very kindly donated to the crowdfunding pot. So the secret email was a slightly gossipy and irreverent kind of take on the trial and the litigation. But then I just carried it on because so many people corresponded with me as a result of it. I got some really important contacts who found me through the secret email. And once they'd read a couple of newsletters, they kind of trusted me a little bit more and so felt more able to come forward and tell their story to me, because if you read someone's sort of casual writing over a period of time, you get a measure of them, and I think that was really helpful in presenting an approachable face, because so many people think, well, God, if I speak to a journalist, then immediately it's going to get broadcast on the BBC the very next day, or the Daily Mail will splash with everything I tell them as soon as I pick up the phone. And it's very much not like that. There are lots and lots and lots of conversations that I have in complete confidence, many of which have remained completely in confidence, with really important people very, very close to this story, who, when I say, well, what do you think about going public with this? They say, actually, no, I'd rather not. And you have to respect that. So being approachable as a journalist is perhaps one of the key skills that I've developed, and has brought me into contact with so many fantastic people who have then trusted me to tell their story, which has then sort of propagated things further. So that the secret email works in a mutual way. I enjoy writing it because it's quite chatty, and whilst I try and make sure that everything I write in it is completely true, it doesn't have to be to the sort of formal way of writing that you might do for a blog post or a article. And as a result, people respond to it, and they come back with tidbits of information and gossip, which I can then put in the next newsletter anonymously, and so it's I think it's a virtuous circle, and it is great fun. And anyone who buys the book through our publisher, Bath Publishing, gets an automatic invite to join the secret emailers. So if you want to join, and it is irregular, it is irreverent, I don't clog up people's inbox too often, and it's very easy to unsubscribe. But if anyone wants to join the email, all you have to do is buy a copy of the book through Bath Publishing, and you will get an automatic request to see if you would like to become a secret emailer and join the ever-growing band.
Brilliant. Club are well worth joining, I can tell you. Nick, thank you so much for, firstly, the work that you've done, because clearly this is not something that doesn't come at a huge amount of personal sacrifice in terms of time and effort. Curiosity, clearly you're someone that's naturally curious about these things and has a real sense of justice, and that comes through both in the way you talk about it, but in the way you write as well. So thank you for that. And above all, from my perspective right now, thank you so much for being an amazing guest on the podcast.
It's been an absolute joy and a pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm very, very grateful.
So that's it for this episode of the Human Risk Podcast. My enormous thanks to Nick for appearing, and of course to you for listening. To find out more about Nick's book, The Great Post Office Scandal, his newsletter, the BBC Radio 4 series that he talked about, and other relevant resources to this case, have a look in the show notes. There are links to those there. If this is your first time listening to the Human Risk Podcast, welcome. You can subscribe wherever you get your quality audio content. It's available on all of the major podcasting platforms. If you like the show and have yet to leave a rating or review for it, please do so. It really does help. I'll be back with another episode of this show very soon. But in the meantime, stay safe. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you soon for another episode of the Human Risk Podcast.